Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, and today we're going to be talking about the Renaissance, specifically about Renaissance humanism. Now, the age of Michelangelo, Leonardo, More, Erasmus, Castiglione, and especially Machiavelli represented the first significant break from the medieval worldview. Now, beginning in the late medieval Italy, artists and writers revived interest in the literary and historical, as opposed to the philosophical and religious, works of the classical age of Greece and Rome. Now, the resulting emphasis on textual accuracy, literacy and education, and above all, the human and the practical, can be seen in new ideas about the qualifications of a gentleman, the role of a woman, and the expectations for a prince. So, what were the ideas behind the Renaissance? Now, every school children, especially freshmen, knows what Renaissance means: rebirth. But what was reborn? Beginning in the 14th century, mostly in Italy, intellectuals and artists began to be more interested in classical, that is, Greek and Roman literature, and art for its own sake. University scholars had long been influenced by Greece and Rome, and the medieval interest in classical writing had been limited to churchmen and university academics. Medieval scholars were not terribly interested in ancient authors per se. Rather, schoolmen in the medieval period were largely interested in ancient authors for how their works could assist them in understanding Greek, Latin, and the rules of logic as laid down by Aristotle, all with the view to comprehending Scripture and ultimately God. But towards the end of the Middle Ages, scholars and artists began to grow interested in Greek and Roman authors for their own sakes, and for what they might say about the human condition. Now, although the Renaissance eventually spread north, east, and west, it's generally agreed to have started in Italy. Now, Italy was perfectly placed to be the European entry point for goods, like fabrics and spices, texts, and ideas from the fabled East. The resultant wealth, combined with the collapse of political control by the Holy Roman Empire, enabled the cities of Italy to gain independence and prosper. Later, after about 1500, the rest of Europe would bypass Italian trade routes and seek to abrogate Italian wealth. And by 1559, Spanish victories largely put an end to the independence of most Italian city-states, though these wars would also allow Renaissance ideas to spread. Now, because Italian wealth centered on cities, Renaissance humanism was, to start off with at least, an intensely urban phenomenon. Now, far more important than the idea of a rebirth of interest in Greece and Rome, the Renaissance saw a shift away from the study of abstract heavenly concerns, that is, theology and philosophy, towards the real, the human, the concrete, and above all, the individual. Now, overall, Renaissance humanism was a valuation of the human, perhaps not over the divine, but in tandem with it. Now, to see this valuation, all we need to do is compare a medieval Madonna and Child with a Renaissance example. Certainly, both artists would have seen their productions as glorifications of God. Humans were His creation, and they were created in His image. But what strikes us about Renaissance images is how much they look like us. Now, these artistic changes began in the Middle Ages. The painter Giotto gave greater weight and presence to the human figure in the 14th century. The sculptor Donatello studied classical masters and attempted to put their principles in practice. Now, Italian merchants, or architects, like Michelozzi and Brunelleschi, rejected the Gothic and went back to simpler classical forms in the 15th century. 15th century artists such as Masaccio used mathematics and observation as contemporary scientists do to solve the problems of perspective. At the same time, the sculptor Ghiberti applied some of these principles to the magnificent east door for the baptistry at Florence. Father Angelico and Father Filippi emphasize brilliant color and sensuality. Castagno and Leonardo da Vinci studied anatomy. Now, this period saw the beginnings of portraiture as well. Rich Italian merchants and Renaissance princes wanted to be memorialized at the hands of such artists as Mantegna and Botticelli. Now, these trends culminated in the masterpieces of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Now, the ideals of the Renaissance spread north thanks in part to the printing press and the wars of the 15th and 16th centuries. This culminated in the work of Holbein, the portraitists in England, and 17th century Dutch painters such as Ruymen, Van Dyck, and later Rembrandt. Note that we know of these people mostly because artists now claimed and achieved far-ranging fame, as opposed to no names being on the artwork in the medieval period. But the real origin and the greatest impact of Renaissance humanism was in literature. Beginning in the 14th century, Europeans began to produce a new kind of literature, less about God and kings and more about human beings. In Italy, Dante was a precursor with his La Divina Commedia, or his Divine Comedy, in 1307. Francesco Petrarca, known as Petrarch, was arguably the founder of humanism, writing poetry and prose in both Latin and Italian. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived from 1313 to 1375, wrote the Decameron. And Lorenzo de' Medici patronized Italian poets as well as painters and sculptors at his court. In England, the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer anticipated later developments as Dante had done, and later humanist works included the sonnets of Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, Spenser's Faerie Queene, Shakespeare's sonnets and plays, and Ben Jonson's poems and plays. In Spain, Don Quixote by Cervantes made fun of medieval notions of knightly conduct. And in France, the poetry of Ronsard, the political satire of Rabelais, and the essays of Montaigne all reflected humanist values. Now, music also experienced a renaissance. Church music remained important, but grew increasingly polyphonic and complex. Secular madrigals and motets, intended to be performed in people's homes, were a development of the songs of the medieval troubadours, and do show a classical influence. For example, Guillaume de Montchaux, Orlando de Lasso, Don Carlo Gesualdo, and Claudio Monteverdi. Now, Renaissance humanism sought to change the world through education. Humanist scholars were highly critical of medieval education, which was often deductive and unadventurous. By extension, humanist scholars were often highly critical of the medieval church and its sometimes shabby logic and intolerance. Humanist scholars advocated a reform and an extension of education beyond the clergy to gentlemen and often women. They believed, like many classical authors before them, that education was necessary to make good citizens. Now, some humanist scholars advocated an education that went far beyond the clergy to encompass even women, as examples seen in Roger Ascham, who tutored Princess Elizabeth. Aristocrats were no longer to be soldiers so much as ministers and officials, serving the prince in peacetime as well as in war. A good prince should, like the Medici or the Borgia, be well educated himself, employ those who were well educated, and promote education and the arts. Now, this would in turn promote civic virtue and glorify the role of the prince. The latter impulse led to an explosion of Renaissance civic art and pageantry, and buildings like St. Mark's in Venice, Brunelleschi's Duomo in Florence, St. Peter's in Rome, Fontainebleau and Louvre in France, and Hampton Court in England. The Renaissance de-emphasis of God for human concerns and human capacities, however, threatened to degenerate its glorification of expediency over virtue. Castiglione and Machiavelli both wrote for their respective princes at the courts of Urbino and Florence. Balthasar Castiglione was a diplomat who published his work The Courtier in 1528. The successful courtier, according to Castiglione, was to be impeccable in his manners, discreet in his behavior, and accomplished in the arts of peace and war. Above all, he was to insinuate himself into the confidence of his prince by telling him the truth, but in the most flattering way possible. Niccolò Machiavelli sought to advise the ruler himself in his work The Prince, written in 1513 but published only posthumously or after his death in 1532. The Prince was part of a long tradition called Mirrors for Princes, but Machiavelli gave this old genre a new humanistic twist. In keeping with the Renaissance de-emphasis on the divine and emphasis on the human, Machiavelli's goal was not to make his prince a better person or get him into heaven. The goal was, rather, to keep the prince in power on earth. To stay in power, the prince would have to become adept at seeming to be good and doing good, and while actually doing whatever it takes to enhance his power. The whole school of Christian writers, including Erasmus and Thomas More, took a different tack from Machiavelli, prodding Renaissance princes to remember their responsibility to their subjects and to the laws of God. In 1509, Erasmus wrote a satire of the human condition and bad government in general called In Praise of Folly. Thomas More wrote Utopia, describing a mythical lamb that was far more just and rational than England. Shakespeare and Montaigne were the ultimate inheritors of this tradition. William Shakespeare, in a series of plays written at the turn of the 17th century, explored the human condition from seemingly every angle. Michel de Montaigne's essays, written in the late 16th century, similarly examined the human condition from a wide variety of angles. Renaissance humanism was dynamite for the old medieval worldview and the great chain of being.